All right, so to review our Mongols, I'm not exactly sure where every class got to, but I think we all got through at least this first part because we talked about the rise of the Mongols, we talked about their influence in China, we talked about their significance in China because what they were able to do was really just transform our comprehension, transform our understanding of what government really is. They were such a phenomenal influence. Obviously, most of that influence happened under their great leader by the name of Genghis Khan. Sometimes you hear it Chinggis, sometimes you hear it Genghis. Um, when we talk about this guy of Genghis Khan, amazing ruler, very unlikely person to come to power like we talked about on Friday, but certainly the kind of person who left an indelible footprint in really world history. When you consider the fact that 1 out of every 6 Chinese people is related to Genghis Khan, the guy had a significant presence in China's history, to say the least. When we talk about Genghis Khan and his army was called the Mongol Horde. And this is more than just the army. It was also the political leaders, the rulers, the people that he had in charge that really made a difference in Mongol control of China. And it was this horde that really made him effective, primarily because of their awesome fighting techniques by their soldiers. In a couple of classes, I mentioned the fact that a Mongol soldier riding bareback on a horse could shoot 6 arrows in 1 minute while traveling on the back of a horse at 35 miles an hour and hit a target. So they were really an impressive military force that ruled not just China but all of Asia, much of the Middle East, had a significant influence over Europe, controlled all of India, well, almost all of India. Their influence and significance was ginormous in the world, conquering more than half the known earth at the time of their reign. Now, Genghis Khan himself was pretty much in this early 1200s age. Now, understand, the Mongols had been an influence on China for 1,000 years. Emperor Qin Shi Huangdi built the wall 1,500 years ago, partially to keep the Mongols out. Also, the more important concern for Emperor Qin Shi Huangdi was the Manchus, but the Mongols were also certainly a prevalent force for him to worry about. But over time, the Mongols had become more and more of a factor in Chinese history, and thus were more and more of a problem for the Chinese governments over time. From 1206 to 1227 was really Genghis Khan's influence, but the influence that Genghis Khan had, was significant because it was a long-lasting influence. The Mongols are going to control China for probably another 250 years after Genghis Khan is dead. So certainly their influence is significant. What the Mongols were especially good at was ruling. And in a couple of classes, we did talk about a couple of these ideas, but one of the things that they did was rule by tribute. And ruling by tribute is a very simple concept in that I'm going to be in charge. I'm going to say that I'm in charge. I'm going to let you do whatever you want in your country, city, state, principality, kingdom, whatever. As long as what you do doesn't in some way upset me, make me angry, make me feel insecure, I'm going to let you do it as long as you do one important thing, and that's give me money. And this money is going to be an insane amount of money. It's a ridiculous amount of money. It's the amount of money that your government will barely be able to function because you're giving so much of it to the Mongols, year after year after year. It was a very effective form of tribute because if you didn't pay this tribute, then the Mongols came, paid your cities a visit, killed everybody, took the women as prisoners, took all of the wealth, destroyed everything, and they were very good at that. Over a decade, 2 decades, people might forget, the Mongols would come and remind them. So they were really an effective group. But some of the other things that they did that were very appealing to people when the Mongols came open, because really the Mongols were a very democratic voice in Asia, because they allowed people to practice their religion. If you were a Buddhist, you could be Buddhist. If you wanted to be a Christian, you could be a Christian. If you wanted to be a Muslim, you could be a Muslim. They really didn't care, as long as you paid your tribute. They didn't care what religion you were. They didn't care what political beliefs you had. They also granted a lot of political freedoms. If you want to have a kingdom, have a kingdom. If you want to set up some kind of oligarchy, go ahead and set up an oligarchy, as long as it comes back to that first item of ruling by tribute. And really, one of the things that they were particularly good at was this idea of social equality for minorities and women. And understand, when we say minorities, we're talking about non-Mongols. As the Mongol Empire grew and grew and grew, it became a very much of what we would call today a rainbow coalition of ethnicities, where there were Caucasians in the Mongol Empire in very important positions. There were Chinese, there were Mongols, there were Japanese, Koreans, Indians from India, not from North America. But all of these different people ended up in various positions because the Mongols really did not care what ethnic background you were. As long as you could somehow help the empire, they gave you an important position. Now, there were a few spots at the top reserved exclusively for the Mongols, but for the most part, they were very egalitarian. Women had property rights in many regions in the Mongol Empire because the women were just as physical and aggressive as the men in the original Mongol tribes that were nomadic herdsmen of the northern plains in China. But the Mongols' influence is going to be prominent because it helps foster the fall of the Song dynasty and kind of leaves a power vacuum in China. So what happens is the Mongols take control, and they establish their own dynasty in China called the Yuan dynasty. This Yuan dynasty was established by the grandson of Genghis Khan, a guy by the name of Kublai Khan. Now, to put this in perspective for you, Genghis Khan had 3 sons that were all equal rulers. He had many other sons, but these 3 sons were his legitimate, well-born children. Those 3 sons all were given 3 different parts of Kublai Khan's empire when he died, because that's what happened, is the children inherited their father's possessions. Their father owned this ginormous estate. Well, the son, of Genghis Khan was the father of Kublai Khan. And so then Kublai took over for his dad when his dad died. His dad died at a relatively young age. So then Kublai Khan became the emperor of China. That was what he inherited. Because understand, that chunk of real estate was worth probably more than the other 2 chunks of real estate combined. So that he is the favored grandson of Genghis Khan. Now, under the Yuan dynasty, the Mongols made China an insanely rich country. Their exorbitant wealth and prosperity became very well known. And the word of the Mongols spread very quickly, and how wealthy they were becoming in China, partially from taxing the heck out of the Chinese, but also from the other exploits of the other Mongol tribes, because they all shared in the wealth of what was going on. So the Yuan dynasty became very, very wealthy in China, and they really shared their wealth well. And our best records of the wealth and power and influence of the Yuan dynasty come from a guy by the name of Marco Polo. And many of you have played the game Marco Polo in the pool before. But what does that really mean? Well, Marco Polo was a son of an explorer. His dad and his uncle decided to leave Italy when Marco Polo was 18 years old. He came back 23 years later with his father and uncle and had these amazing stories. These stories were published in a book. This book is the 2nd most popular book in the history of mankind, meaning the number of people that could read, the number of people that could purchased it. It was an insanely popular book, to say the least. The only book that was more popular was the Bible. So when Marco Polo comes back and he has all of these amazing stories of the unbelievable wealth that was in China, Marco Polo told probably some little white lies and some flat out lies, because Marco Polo talked about the fact that he had become a very close advisor to the great Kublai Khan, and that Kublai Khan constantly was asking him his advice and his opinion. Now, is it possible that the Emperor of China took an 18-year-old boy under his wing and helped him understand the world outside of China? Yes, it's possible. Is it likely? No. Most historians agree that Marco Polo probably had absolutely nothing to do with Kublai Khan, and that most of his quote-unquote first-hand accounts were actually stories told to him by either a prostitute or a concubine, maybe a close advisor to the emperor, Kublai Khan, because most people would have not had access to that information. So in that sense, he did have insider information. Perhaps if Marco Polo was actually had information there, he probably was an insider in that he was in the palace when this stuff happened. But the fact that he was an advisor to Emperor Kublai Khan was probably not likely. So many of his stories may or may not be true. But what it did is it helped foster an unbelievable desire by Europeans to get to the East. And so remember our Silk Road that we talked about many days ago? Well, what happens is this Silk Road kind of like gets an injection of steroids and just becomes this super uber economic boom that makes the Yuan dynasty even richer and even richer and even richer. And we start to see trade routes through Central Asia, through India, through Russia. The problem is going by land became very, very, very dangerous, because in order to go to China and get goods and bring them back to Europe, you had to take a lot of money. Nobody really wanted to travel with a lot of money, because then if it got stolen, you'd have nothing left. So this really, for a lot of historians look at this as really kind of the beginning of the age of discovery, of discovering new lands, because people wanted to get to that East Asian government. Now, one of the unique things about the Yuan dynasty is that they didn't really trust the Chinese, and rightfully so. The Chinese didn't like the Yuan dynasty because they weren't Chinese. And as we all know, the Chinese are a cut above the rest. At least that's what they believed in China. So what the Yuan dynasty did is, rather than reinvent the wheel, they said, okay, we're going to use this governmental structure that the Chinese have used for 3,000 years. But if it's an important position, we're going to make sure there's a Mongol in those positions too. So like our tax collectors, we're going to have a Chinese guy and a Mongol guy go out and collect taxes. And every important position is going to have a Mongol guy and a Chinese guy in it. We're still going to keep the Chinese employed. Now, the downside is this gets kind of expensive. It tends to be a little redundant, and we see those kinds of things become problematic. But really, for the Yuan dynasty, this was a matter of maintaining control over China. So for every Chinese government official, we had a Mongol official. Again, it got very expensive, but it seemed very practical and an effective way for the Mongols to maintain control over their own empire. Well, eventually, like all dynasties, our Yuan dynasty started to fade, and they were replaced by the Ming dynasty, overthrown by a peasant by the name of Zhu. Now, this peasant really decided that it was time to change things up in China and get rid of the Mongols. And so he decided to start a rebellion. The people were tired of Mongols and the redundancy and how expensive the government was and how much money it cost. So they said, we're done with this. And they overthrew the Mongols. And then we saw the rise of the Ming dynasty. Now, this Ming dynasty is kind of called the golden age of Chinese history because they started to imperialize a lot of Asia. They had a strong influence in Japan. They had a strong influence in Korea, Southeast Asia. They reached their control into the Taklamakan Desert. Anytime we talk about a golden age of a history, we talk about a flowering of culture, the economy, etc. And they really kind of pushed this idea of China for the Chinese. In fact, in 1421, under the Ming dynasty, the Chinese sent out explorers to cover the world. And they believe, historians have enough accurate evidence that they believe that the Chinese are actually the ones who discovered America, and that when Christopher Columbus sailed 70 years later, he was actually using Chinese maps that he had acquired through the Silk Road, through trade, to help him, quote unquote, discover America. So when we talk about the influence of the Ming dynasty, it was significant in a sense, but it was kind of a death knell because the Ming dynasty was really the beginning of the end for dynastic rule in China, because then came the Qing. Now the Qing are Manchus. They, like the Yuan dynasty, are foreigners who came in to control China. They ruled like the Mongols, 2 people per job, and they resisted foreign influence. They did not like having foreign influence. The Ming dynasty kind of welcomed foreigners. The Qing did not like foreigners, which of course is ironic because they themselves were foreigners. Because you have to understand there's a lot of differences between the Chinese and the Manchus. They had very little interest in trading with Western nations. They had very little interest in doing things. The Europeans wanted silk, porcelain, tea, spices. The Chinese didn't want anything that the Europeans had. They weren't even interested in guns. Now, eventually that would change and they would realize the necessity of having guns. But the Chinese really didn't want to trade. What you're going to read about today kind of continues on with what happened to our Qing dynasty.